Okay, picking up where we left off on page 317, we're still talking about the advanced filter. Let's just show you how this thing's supposed to work when you have multiple rows here. I type in a second criteria like mix, and then go through the little doodad one more time, and it ends up filtering on both the local and the mix. Anyway, advanced filter is a little complex, but the thing you need to know is if you have multiple criteria rows, whenever you add a criteria in the vertical direction, for example, I want local or mix, so adding in the vertical direction makes the filtered data get bigger, okay? So it makes the list grow. If you were to add criteria in the horizontal direction, you're actually going to make the data list shrink. So now there's a better way of being able to do these filters. There's a thing called the slicer. Unfortunately, we're using Excel 2010 in this case, so I can't demo the slicer just yet. So yes, if you're on the 2013 or the new 2016 version, yes, you can apply the slicer and do this in a heck of a lot better, more convenient way than this goofy little thing. But we're going to postpone the talk on page 319 on slicers. We're going to postpone until we get into doing pivot tables in just a minute. All right, on page 322, they bring back the topic of subtotals. Now, we did this in Chapter 2. We talked about row visibility. Remember all that stuff? So basically, all I have to do is to go down to here, find me a spot, and you can type the word subtotal. Remember how you do this? So I do, subtotal. And then you have to give it this goofy numeric code to tell it what it is you want to do. In this case, I want to do, like, I don't know, sum, which is 109. And then you have to give it the range, like E9 to E208. Okay, and so that's the sum of the rows that are filtered. Remember, so if I go back in and apply the filter a second time, this number is going to change. And by the way, the list of those, the criteria is on table 1, page 323. It's the same list you had in Chapter 2, so nothing's different. Okay, so now we're ready to move on. Pivot tables, page 325. Now this is, unlike advanced filtering, this is actually pretty doggone cool stuff. So I'm going to go back to this guy, and I want to do what's called a pivot table. So first thing I need, what is a pivot table? Pivot table tells me all sorts of interesting things. Like, for example, I want a summary of all the people in New Mexico, what they're doing here, versus all the people in California. What I want to do is I want to do some what-in analysis. Which home state, for example, spends the most amount of money? Okay? So it's not really filtering here necessarily, because you could, but you'd have to filter it on New Mexico, and then filter it on California, and then filter it on, you have to do filter after filter after filter. So what essentially I want to do is I want to apply multiple filters at once. And so they make this incredibly easy by this thing called a pivot table. So first part of doing a pivot table would be kind of find a spot to put it. So I'm just going to click on a blank spot. Doesn't actually matter where, but I'm just picking this guy. So I'm going to go to Insert, and one of the first things is Pivot Table. So I'm just going to hit the Pivot Table. And the first thing it's going to ask me is, give me the table or the range. Now, I can cheat here. I can type in Table 1. Remember, because I actually have a guy called Table 1. Or you can go ahead and just lasso all this data just like we always did. Okay, cool. And hit the button. Now, my pivot table doesn't actually have anything in it yet. It's just a blank spot there saying, hey, when you start doing with this. Now, the way I learned pivot tables was I just started kind of playing with it. Like, I wonder what this does. Let's try that. So, for example, if I know that I want, like, the home state to be, like, in the y-axis, okay, with the row labels. So here's the 4 places where you can put fields. I can put a field in a row, make it show up as a row, make it show up as a column, and then throw in some math. Almost always, these are going to be not things like states, because you can't really do math on states, right? So most of the time, the system can kind of figure. So if I click on home state, the machine's going to say, well, that does not look like a report filter, and it's certainly in the value. So more than likely it's going to be one of these guys. If I just click on home state, it's doink. It says, I assume you want that to be a row label. Good assumption. Cool. Now, let's do food order. Okay. Now, it's going to look at that and go, that's number. And you clearly did not want to put that over here. So more than likely it's going to put it in the right spot. So I'm going to put food order in next. Doink. And what it basically did is it went in there and said, what is the sum of all the food orders for all of the states? Isn't that pretty cool? So for example, and you could go in here, actually sort this thing, and come up with how many states have so New Mexico has the largest food order, as an example. So this is the way of spinning the data and coming up with some really cool ways of looking at it. Now, I'm going to make one a little bit more complex. So I want to know the party size in addition, or how about customer type? Let's do customer type. So if I just click this guy, it's going to say, look, I'm not exactly sure what you meant. So I'm going to put that down here as a row label, which is okay. So the food order for Arizona was $667, and hotel was counted for that amount. Now, what if I didn't want that? What if I really wanted that to be a two-dimensional kind of a spin to it? Same data, just showing it differently. So I want that to be a column label rather than kind of a collapsed row label. So to make it a column label, all I have to do is just pick it up and move it, so to speak. So I grab this customer type and I just drag it over here and let go. And doink. So now I have the local and mixed types for each one of these guys. Isn't that pretty cool? All right, so this is kind of an interesting way of coming up with a pivot table. Let me show you another example that's a little easier to understand, because I don't want you to kind of get off with pivot tables being horribly complex. Let's do a simple one. All right, remember this guy? This is the grade guy. All I want to know is how many A's, how many B's, how many C's. That's all I want to know. So I'm going to use a pivot table to essentially count the number of A's, B's, and C's. Okay? That's all. So I go here a blank spot just like I did before. I go insert, I go pivot table. I don't have a data table now. This is just rows and columns. So I still have to copy the heading across the top. Okay, cool. So all I really want is the grade, okay? So that gave me the row labels, but I also want the grade a second time. I want to count the number of grades. So I want grades to show up over here. All right, now there's no math associated with a grade because it's like an A and a B and a C. So if I just grab this guy and drop him in here, the machine is going to automatically figure out that I want it to count. Okay, because I can't do average. What's the average of a letter A, right? But it can do counting. So it figured out appropriately that the row label was grade. I just drug the grade over here, and now I know there are 6 A's, 7 B's, 3 C's, 3 D's, and 3 F's in here. So let's go back to the complicated one. So here I have this complicated one. I have customer type and all those kind of things. If I wanted to make it a little simpler, just for my example here. Now, instead of just having the normal thing where it figured out I wanted to do the sum of something, if I wanted to instead to do count or average, let's say I wanted to average by state, average of food order by state. There's a thing called the field settings. Now, I'll admit this is probably not a good name for this, but the field setting is the one that changes it between count, like we did with the grades, or sum, like it figured out from here, because there's lots of other choices here. So I hit this little button, and so I want to say, I don't know, average. Okay, so I hit the button. So now this is the average food order by state, instead of just having that. So you get full control of what goes in the column, what goes in the row, what goes into here, and you kind of spin it any way you like. There's a couple things in here that's kind of weird, and that is grouping. So I'm gonna throw something in here where the data is not grouped, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm gonna throw in tea time. So if I throw in tea time, I'm just gonna let it go here, and you look at this and you go, oh, come on. That's just way too much data. Maybe come on. Maybe I should summarize this a little bit. Well, there is a way you can do this. Is if I grab one of these pieces of data, one of the options under Pivot Tools is a thing called grouping. And if I say group the field, now most of the time when you do grouping, you're grouping on things where you want to reduce the amount of data. For example, here I've got down to the minute. Okay, maybe I don't want down to the minute. Maybe like the hour would be sufficient. Okay, so I'm going to hit the group field and it says, what do you want? Well, I want, for example, hours. So it takes that data and groups it down into just the number. Basically, it's round off, okay? So I hit the button. Doink. So now, instead of having all of the 7:10 and 7:45, it's all the 7 a.m. ones. So this is a cool way of grouping the data to kind of remove some of the stuff. There's a date in here, so I'm going to take the tea time off, put the date back in, okay? Now again, this time, again, it's just as unwieldy. It's tons and tons of data in there that I don't want any of that. Maybe I want to summarize by month. Okay, so I'm going to filter by month in this case. So I click on the date. Whoops, sorry. Go back here to group. And one of the ones, the choices are months. So I hit the button. Doink. And so now it has summarized it, grouped it by month. Okay, so grouping is a very cool way of just reducing just a volume of stuff you have. Because maybe you wanted to do it by quarter. And maybe you want to do it by month. Maybe you want to do it by year. Instead of just having tons and tons and tons of data, it'll actually allow you to go in there and do grouping. So, anytime there's a field that's just too voluminous for you to use, for example, names. On the example with the grades, putting the names out there, maybe I want them like A through D and, E through whatever, and group them up alphabetical or something silly like that. So whenever there's too much data, but you still want to show it, use this grouping thing. Okay, so typically, I will tell you, typically it's used for things like date and time, okay, typically. Normally you wouldn't use it for, breaking up chunks of people's names by, but you could, but just not normal. Okay, now I can show you the slicer. I couldn't show you the slicer before because 2010 doesn't do slicer. But right here, you see this goofy little thing that says slicer? And I'm going to go in and insert a slicer. And basically, what do you want to slice this data on? Well, I want to slice it on the date. Now, remember we had this thing grouped? Now, so here's a question. Is the slicer going to inherit the group settings? Yeah, it will. So this is what the slicer looks like. The slicer is this very cool graphical view of all of that. And now I can go say, just show me the Januaries. Or show me the January, or how about the Aprils? Isn't that pretty cool? Isn't this a heck of a lot easier than that goofy advanced filter stuff? I can hold the control key down and say I'll take, June and, February and, those kind of things. You can go in there and pick things out. Kind of cool. And this is the one that clears them all. There's also some ways you can go in there and make this pretty. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but hey. I can actually change the kind of thing and how many columns it is. I can have these things, do like that. And anyway, so this is actually pretty doggone cool. I can go in here and just set these filters using this thing called a slicer. Now, if you were using the 2013 version, you could have used this exact same thing on just the filtering the rows. Now, we can't use it here, but slicers are actually pretty doggone cool. All right, this is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up again in just a few.